The highway was a pale ribbon under a sky shredded by snow. Headlights blurred into the white, then vanished, then reappeared, as Jackson Ryder kept his truck slow and steady through the storm. His breath fogged the glass. The farmhouse behind him sat dark and quiet, a single wreath caught in the porch light, ornaments muffled by frost. He had been driving towards solitude on purpose, carrying the kind of loneliness that fit into the small things, an extra mug in the cabinet that he ne'er used, a guitar with one broken string, the empty place at the table where Daniel's plate had been. Christmas Eve had always been less a day and more a rendezvous he learned to manage. Tonight he was managing it by putting miles between himself and the quiet, by letting the road and the wind and the blur of headlights do the thinking for him. Then, in the half-second between the sweep of his high beams and the drift of snow, a figure appeared on the shoulder, small, hunched, a flash of dark against the white. Hazard lights bobbed like a nervous heartbeat. Jackson slowed, pulled off, and left the truck idling with the heater on. The sound of the engine melted into the storm. Up close, the boy, because he was a boy by the way his shoulders folded, looked smaller than the distance suggested. His jacket was too thin. His hands were bare. Snow had clung to the fabric of his hair. He held something in one mittened hand, a scrap of paper creased and soggy. "Hey," Jackson said, voice low and careful. "You all right?" The boy's eyes were wide and red, not just from cold. He looked at Jackson like someone looking for an answer he didn't expect to get. He nodded, then shook his head. He swallowed. The scrap of paper slipped free and unfurled in a wet curl at his feet. There were words on it in a hurried scrawl. One line caught Jackson before anything else. "Dad will kill me." The phrase landed like a stone. It felt too loud in the snow. For a moment, everything else was reduced to small logistics. A scrap of paper, a voice, a danger that wasn't remote. It was immediate and specific. "Kid." Jackson crouched down against the wind. He smelled the boy's breath, mint and fear. "What's your name?" "Finn," came the answer, barely a whisper. "Finn, we're getting you somewhere warm." He wasn't asking. He couldn't let the boy stay at the side of the road. The thought of the paper on the wet shoulder, the words half-soaked, was like a wound he didn't know how to close, except by carrying the boy away. They sat in the cab, heater blowing on their knees, the winter outside pressing against the glass like a living thing. Finn's legs trembled beneath his thin jacket. Jackson handed him a blanket from the back seat he kept for emergencies. When Finn's fingers closed on it, they were like a child's. The truck smelled like diesel and the faint lemon of the hand soap Jackson used. He poured them both coffee from a thermos and waited for the heat to reach the boy's hands.
"It was supposed to be a..." Finn's voice broke. He didn't finish the sentence. He pressed the scrap of paper between his gloved fingers and looked at the line Jackson had read. "I cut a text off his phone," Finn said. "I wanted to see if he would..." He stopped again. The words were thin and brittle. He saw them, and he told me to get out. Said I was a lie, that I'd shame the family. He left me on the road. He said..." Finn's face shifted. The memory was an animal that had not been tamed. "He said he'll kill me if I keep being who I am." Jackson felt the old deputy's muscles knot in his shoulders, the reflex to put an arm around someone and make sure they breathed. He had been out of uniform for 3 years, but the habits howled quietly. He didn't ask about names or titles or power yet. He slid his phone out of his pocket and then remembered the signal strength, a single white bar shivering like a candle. Nothing. They were beyond most towers. The storm had eaten reception. "There's a farmhouse not far," Jackson said. "You can get warm in a minute. We'll check, call someone in the morning." Finn's smile was sudden and searching, the kind that comes from survival, not from comfort. Will you just hold that?" He nodded to the scrap on the floor. "I was going to..." He swallowed. "I was going to hand it to him like a surrender note. I thought maybe if he saw the words He won't read it tonight," Jackson said. "He won't be standing here in the storm. You don't have to hand anything over." Finn closed his eyes and leaned back into the seat. "I'm 17. The published headlines could call him whatever. In the cab of Jackson's truck, he was simply a boy, freezing at the edge of the road, who had feared his father's threat enough to leave a note. The Mafia boss part of his father's identity wasn't exactly the kind of detail Jackson wanted to test out in the wind, but it explained the look on Finn's face, fear mixed with a blunt, practical sense of being expendable. Robert Holloway. Holloway was a name that landed in rural towns like a command, a man whose life had taught people to lower their eyes and make room in conversations. Jackson had heard the name long ago, a rumor of influence, of money that moved quietly. It was a label that made a frightened boy's story more dangerous, and it made Jackson's chest go restless. "You're coming home with me," Jackson told him. "You can sleep somewhere warm. We'll figure the rest out. Sheriff Miller's a good man. He'll listen." If that was all it took, Finn finding shelter, Jackson would have been content. But the paper on the floor with its accusation was not a private thing, not once it had been left at the shoulder of the highway. It demanded a response. At the farmhouse, Jackson unlatched the storm door, and the heat hit them like a hand. The place smelled like dry wood and old coffee.
There were traces of another life layered under the quiet. A sock folded over a chair, a coat still on the peg where Daniel had hung it months ago, a studio with canvases leaning against the wall and brushes in jars. Daniel's coffee mug sat by the sink, 2 faint lipstick stains edged with a ring of dust. Jackson had not cleaned the kitchen properly in months. He had not wanted to. The empty chair felt like a silent partner keeping watch. Finn's fingers trembled as Jackson took his hood off. Snowflakes clung to his lashes. He walked through the house like he was stepping into someone else's memory and not sure he had the right to be there. He made small sounds, an intake of breath when he found the painted apron, a quiet, incredulous laugh when he saw the pile of wrapping paper and ribbons Jackson used as scrap for the studio. Daniel's studio. Jackson had kept it untouched. Paint smelled like hope and guilt. He made 2 bowls of stew and 2 slices of bread. No questions then, just nourishment, and the sound of the kettle singing over the stove like a domestic hymn. Finn ate like he'd been starving, and with each bite his color came back, the flood that replaced shock with exhaustion. Jackson listened to the clink of the spoon against the bowl and let his hands find the cups and mugs he used every morning for Daniel's coffee. "You can sleep in the studio," Jackson said when the stew was gone. "There's an old mattress and more blankets than you'd think." "Why are you doing this?" Finn asked. He had the bluntness of someone who didn't want pity later. "You don't even know me." Jackson felt the question like a probe in his ribs. He picked up a jar of brushes and set it on the table. "Because I know what it's like to come home and find somebody missing," he said. He didn't say Daniel's name right away. He didn't have to. The house carried the missing man's memory like a slow, steady temperature. "Because you can't sleep out in a storm," he added. "Because when someone hands you a paper that says, 'Dad will kill me,' you don't leave them on the road." Finn clutched the scrap of paper like it angered him. "He told me he was a boss," Finn said. "Said people listen when he says something about his family, that he'd make sure." He didn't finish. He called me a shame. There was an ache in the way he said it, a small, hot pain that belonged to a child who expected love and received a threat. Jackson thought of Daniel's hand on his shoulder the first time they told each other they loved one another, steady, without drama. It felt like an anchor against a world that could be cruel. He wanted to give Finn something like that, something small that didn't require legal systems or big speeches. A warm bed, a hot shower, a towel that smelled like soap. That night, Finn slept on a threadbare mattress under a sky of paint-splattered canvases. He left the scrap of paper folded on the nightstand, a reminder of what had brought him here. Jackson sat on the porch for a long time, watching the yard where snow pawed at the edges of the light. He thought of Daniel's hands, and the way grief had made him alternately careful and clumsy. The ache of the house was familiar, but it didn't feel hollow. Finn's presence was like a small return of light. Morning came soft and pale. The storm had spent itself. Jackson made calls. Without cell signal the night before, the 2 of them had been stranded in limbo. Now there were options. Sheriff Miller's cruiser rolled up the dirt drive with the quiet authority of someone used to stepping into other people's chaos and making sense of it. Miller was a large man with small, deliberate movements and a face that had learned to be patient with people's worst days. He listened with the careful attention of someone who had spent his life at kitchen tables and hospital floors. "You sure about the note?" Miller asked when Jackson passed him the damp scrap. Sheriff Miller read the words and let the silence hold. "We'll get it on record," Miller said. "We don't leave kids out on the roadside. We'll get the DA involved." When Jackson said, "Mafia boss," Miller did not flinch or make grand assumptions. He made calls. He spoke into the radio like someone arranging chess pieces. Robert Holloway's name drew a different rhythm in the local network. respect mixed with calculation. Jackson noticed it and kept his jaw loose. The point of naming the man wasn't to build a narrative of fear. It was to make sure the right people were listening and that Finn's fear got the attention it required. They took Finn down to the station not because they had to, but because there needed to be paperwork that validated his story. Finn's voice came in little flutters through the questioning, raw and honest. He told the officer everything in stammered, precise bursts that suggested a mind trying to make sense of betrayal. He admitted the theft of texts, the argument, the shove of words that ended with him pushed out into the storm. The city was careful with its own. Miller handled the social worker like someone threading a needle, slow and certain. Robert Holloway didn't come to the station in a sweat of violence or under the hood of some avenging machismo. He came later, when men in suits assumed a pall over the precinct and when a car with dark glass rolled up outside. Rumors traveled before him as breath. He moved with the smooth, practiced dignity of someone who had grown up with power and had learned the right angles to hold it. When he saw Finn, when everyone else in the room saw the pale bundle, the hardened expression on Holloway's face slackened for the first time. He froze, not with the theatrics of a villain in a movie, but with the look of a man realizing a small detail had eluded him. His mouth closed around an apology that did not come. The arrest, when it happened, was not dramatic. Sheriff Miller did not stage a show.
He laid out the allegations, endangerment, abandonment, like a ledger of consequences that needed to be tallied. For all Holloway's influence, the law had a way of reducing men to small, accountable things. Did you leave your child in the road? Did you threaten him? The charges were plain. Journalists would later speak about the arrest in hushed tones, about power and its limits. At the moment, Holloway simply stood in front of the badge and looked as if he had been stunned by the idea of being small in a public way. He did not rage, he froze, like an animal that had been told its territory was not absolute. There were practical complications no one wanted to romanticize. Holloway's name meant lawyers and scrutiny. Finn's status as a minor meant social work had to step in. There were meetings about placement and long conversations about whether the state would place him in foster care, whether he could go home to a relative, whether he needed a guardian. Jackson's status as a private citizen complicated things too. He was not the sort who took risks with legality. He had left being a deputy to stop taking people's stories apart. Now he found himself threading his life into Finn's in ways that would make paperwork messy. Over the next weeks, the house pulsed with the bureaucratic as much as the domestic. There were phone calls with a lawyer, a meeting at the DA's office where Finn watched men talk like he was a fragile object and not a person with agency. He was a kid who carried a sketchbook like a talisman. He doodled in the margins when things got too long. He drew hands more than faces. Jackson noticed this and liked the way Finn lingered on the little gestures people made. Art became a language between them. Finn painted like someone with a hunger for color he had been denied. He painted a pair of hands in oils for Daniel's studio and left the image leaning against the wall like a prayer. The house filled with canvases, small studies of the barn, big skies made with broad knife strokes, a portrait of Jackson in the kind of light that made his jaw softer. Jackson spent evenings chopping wood and listening to Finn talk about art school and a professor in town who suggested his work had a way of making things ache in a beautiful way. The house smelled better, the paint tin solvent and dinner and candle wax, and in the mornings they dragged blankets into the living room and fixed coffee. Finn learned how to build a fire without getting ash in his hair. Jackson learned how to stand in the kitchen and let someone else bring the music back to a house that had been full of silence. There were nights Finn woke up, gasping. He would sit on the edge of the mattress in the studio, hands pressed to his throat like a lifeline. Jackson would find him, fingers light on Finn's arm. "You're safe here," he'd say. The 3 words were small and frequent, and they wanted to be enough. On an uneven night, Finn said, "I keep thinking he'll come to the door and say it was a mistake, that he'll act sorry." He sounded like someone evaluating a lie to see if it could become a true thing again. Jackson thought of Daniel and the way grief had made the world feel fragile and then resilient all at once. He did not have the right words for what it was to be left. He had words that were practical: therapists, lawyers, shelter options, the DA's office. But he also had the oddest, truest resource: the ability to sit in a kitchen and hold a mug until the heat steadied fingers. Outside, the town did what small places do. People noticed and then noticed again. Chicken coops and gas stations and the coffee shop where Jackson sometimes bought a paper. News travels by human thread. There were notes under the boxes at the feed store offering folks to help. An anonymous bag of clothes dropped on their porch one morning, a neighbor's casserole that lasted 3 dinners. Finn's presence made the house less of a shrine to memory and more of a place that could tolerate people living there. The legal machinery churned. Holloway hired a lawyer. The initial hearing turned into a spectacle of baritone voices and firm sentences. But the charge that stuck was not a melodramatic indictment of an entire life. It was a narrow, stinging thing: endangerment. The DA's office made a point, carefully and quietly, about minors and duty of care. Finn's statement was recorded. He did not have to face Holloway in court. Holloway didn't need to plead to everything. The law's gears are not always fine enough to dissolve power, but they could, in this case, create a public ledger of wrongdoing that mattered to a young man who had been left in the snow. There were moments that felt like small miracles because of their ordinary nature. Finn enrolled in a community art class with a professor who had encouraged him. He started showing up on time, a little less guarded, tracing lines with confidence. Jackson learned how to photograph canvases properly and to tape the edges of frames. They agreed on chores. Finn fed the chickens, Jackson fixed the fence posts. Meals were shared without ceremony. The house's rhythm was a kind of healing. Repetition is medicine. There were hard days. Finn got a call with a voice on the other end that left him white and trembling. Holloway had access, through legal channels or private calls, to things that made people's lives shift. The calls sometimes were attempts at intimidation, sometimes cold offers of lawyers in silence, sometimes a representative trying to negotiate solitude. Sheriff Miller put a line in place that was both precise and humane. No contact was to initiated. The judge signed something that kept Holloway distant, at least physically. There were days when Finn would curl on the porch and look at the road, and Jackson could see the muscle of wariness in the way he wrapped his arms around himself.
The months that followed unfolded like a long watercolor, edges bleeding into one another. Therapy sessions where Finn learned how to name his fear, without letting it be the singular thing that defined him. Evenings when Jackson and Finn bickered about what counted as clean. Nights when Jackson would catch Finn with paint on his hands and arrest him in the doorway with the dumb, delighted look anyone gets when they see the other living their life. Finn's art grew hungrier and better, and with it, the state of being saved, if such a thing exists, wasn't instantaneous. It was 1,000 small permissions to exist and be seen. As the legal case narrowed, community voices mattered in a way that felt almost ancient. A teacher wrote a note about Finn's talent. A neighbor vouched for what he'd become in a place where people are known by their patterns. Sheriff Miller's testimony was steady and unshowy, a man who had watched a frightened boy in the storm and who had seen what small kindness could do. Holloway's lawyer tried to paint the story as more complicated than that. Holloway, calmer now in a courtroom where not everyone bowed, sat with a face that suggested entitlement and shame had danced together. When the judge read the temporary restraining order and the official record of endangerment, Holloway's expression shifted again. He was a man used to moving others like chess pieces. Being made to stand still, publicly, felt like mercy to someone used to moving without consequence. He froze in the way men sometimes do when institutions they thought they could manipulate show up as walls. None of it fixed everything. The hearings concluded in ways that fit their scope. Holloway was fined, compelled to anger management classes, so the DA's office reported, and charged on the narrow count of endangerment. He was not carted away in a dramatic coda as if power were always toppled by law, but his public posture was diminished in the specific ways that mattered. He could not erase the record of what he'd done, nor could he remove Finn's choice to walk into a truck and a stranger's kindness and a community's attention. If there was a turning point that felt less procedural and more personal, it came one night when a stack of papers lay on the kitchen table and Finn stared at them like they were foreign language. He had been offered a spot in a city art program, but the logistics were knotted: financials, housing, a legal guardian's signature because of his age. He looked like a man at a crossroads, only younger, his features sketched with exhaustion. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked Jackson, voice thinner than usual. It was the simple question that did not need legal jargon. It needed honesty. Jackson folded the stack of letters with a careful hand. He had been through forms, made calls, filled the house with references and affidavits. He could have offered shelter until Finn was 21 and beyond, but he had also learned the hard truth that stability was not a vow writ on a napkin. He had lost someone, and he carried that loss daily like a stone. He could not promise forever. He would never promise to be more than he might be. But he could offer what he had. He could offer the patchwork of a life that had room for one more. "I can take care of you," Jackson said. "I can help with the paperwork. I can be your guardian if that's what you want." Finn's eyes filled. There was a risk in saying yes. There was a risk in committing to something that might fracture. Finn considered the words, like someone trying on a jacket in front of a cold mirror. "What about you?"
Are you sure? Jackson looked down at his hands, the hands that once cuffed people and now chopped wood, rubbed paint from the bristles, tried to learn how to mend the small things. I'm sure I'm willing to try, he said. I don't have to be the man your father was. I can be someone who keeps you safe, who helps. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want. When Finn nodded, the gesture was a small, decisive motion. It was not a surrender to a man who had questions or to the idea that this would be easy. It was a commitment to a gradual, patient life. They went to the DA and a lawyer, and the forms were inked in ways that made the world more navigable. There were times when the system hiccuped and schedules slipped, but the core decision had been made. Jackson would step into a role that asked more of him than he had imagined. Finn said yes to someone who had been given a second chance at being whole. The house changed accordingly. Finn's paintings moved from drying in the studio to hanging on the walls. He painted the porch light at dusk and a jar of knives on the sink. He painted Jackson's hands, big and reliable. The painting of Jackson hung in the living room like a small altar. It made the house look like a home. They began small acts that made things better for others. Finn and Jackson installed a weatherproof box under the old oak at the side of the road where Finn had been found. People could leave blankets, snacks, gloves, basic things for someone who had to make a sudden decision in a blizzard. Finn painted a sign for it in blocky letters. Take if you need, donate if you can. Over the year, they collected toys and coats and made sure the shelter down in town had a steady supply of art supplies. Finn's art began to show in small, local galleries. The professor who'd encouraged him brought his piece to a community show, and the frame of his painting of Jackson sold at a silent auction for a modest price that they used to pay for a new heater and some back taxes. More importantly, people who had seen the work began to understand the story that art can carry. Finn's voice grew less brittle. He became a volunteer at a youth center on Saturday afternoons, helping kids make their first bad, earnest paintings.
He taught a boy with cold hands how to smear paint in a way that made him smile. They never glamorized Holloway or made him the central villain of their narrative. He remained a man who wielded influence and who had made a choice that brought a child to a roadside. He was accountable in the narrow ways the law allowed. The community's attention was less about retribution and more about ceremony of care. They had noticed a boy on a snowy shoulder and decided to do something. Months softened the edges. The first Christmas since Finn arrived was quieter than anything Jackson remembered with Daniel, and it was different in good ways. They hung lights with a crooked sort of precision, bought a small tree that looked like a sapling, and decorated it with Finn's paint-splattered ribbons. They wrapped gifts for volunteers and slept with the window cracked open a little to let the cold in like a punctuation mark. On the porch at twilight, Finn and Jackson sat with cups of cocoa, steam blurred and small in the cold. Finn's hands were stained with blue from a painting he had finished earlier that week, the hands of a man cradling a small bird. He turned the mug and looked at Jackson. "Do you regret it?" he asked bluntly. Jackson blinked at the question. He thought of the slow work of days, the ache that did not vanish, the way he had learned to love a house again. He had been the man who thought a life could be ordered neatly into boxes, and who had been undone by unarranged grief. He had been small in his own ways. "No," he said finally. "I don't." Finn's smile was simple and shifting. He reached out and touched Jackson's forearm, paint on fingers pressed against the thick skin of winter. "You saved me," he said. Jackson's mouth twitched, the way a man smiles when someone gives him an impossible compliment. He thought of Daniel and how both of them had been saved in different ways. "You saved me too," he said. "You helped me keep the door open." There was no flourish. The scene was not a cinematic crescendo with violins and light. It was two people on a porch in a small town who had rearranged their lives enough to allow safety and art and the chance to breathe. They had made a home together that had room for missteps and for second mornings. In the spring, they painted the weatherproof box again, a brighter red, new lettering, and left it stuffed with art kits and a stray scarf thrown in by a neighbor. Finn's classes went well. He taught a workshop at the youth center about painting hands. Kids came with scraped knees and new hope, and left with half-dried canvases and the sense that someone had seen them. Through it all, Sheriff Miller remained a quiet presence, stopping by with a ham or some small gossip. He checked in without intrusion. Holloway's figure receded into the background of legal settlements and the ordinary consequences of a man who had been made to stand still. He did not explode into the story again. He paid fines. He attended mandated meetings. He visited no more. The way power had once frozen people's mouths now seemed less absolute. The last scene that felt like a closing came in the late afternoon when Finn presented Jackson with a painting he had worked on for weeks, a portrait of Jackson, hands stained with paint and wood dust, eyes soft and sure. The image did not idolize him. It showed a man who had been broken and who was learning, day by day, to repair the parts he could. Finn painted the porch in the background, the weatherproof box like a bright punctuation mark. He signed the bottom with his name and a date. Jackson put his hand on the canvas and felt the ridges of dried paint. "I never thought I'd have a painting of me," he said, half laughing. Finn shrugged, paint on his thumb. "You need one," he said, "so you can remember there's proof." They hung it in the living room where anyone who stepped in could see it. It made the house look like a life in process. Rough edges, ongoing repairs, the visible marks of people who had chosen to stay. On the road where the truck had found him that first night, Finn and Jackson built a small altar of sorts, not religious in the strict sense, more like a human marker. It had a weatherproof box with supplies and a small plaque that read, in Finn's blocky letters, "If you're cold, take this." Underneath, "You're not alone." A neighbor donated a roll of reflective tape for the shoulder. They left sandwiches and a thermos once the season turned. People dropped notes. Others left gloves. It was a slow work of kindness, a protest against indifference. And when Robert Holloway's name came up in town, people spoke about him the way you speak of a man whose shadow has been reduced. They didn't gloat. They were simply people who had learned, through a small act at the side of the road, how to be available to one another. On the porch at sunset, with strings of lights making the yard look like a constellation brought low, Jackson and Finn sat together and watched the season slide into itself. Finn's hand rested on Jackson's knee, paint dust under his nails. The world beyond the yard was not suddenly safe in every way. There would always be risks and bureaucratic corners, and nights when old fears surfaced. But there was also an ordinary bravery, making stew, returning calls, paying the bills, showing up at the youth center to untangle a child's hand from a paintbrush. "It's funny," Finn said, eyes on the horizon. "I thought the note would be how everyone would remember me. Like a single line that defined everything. But it's not. It's the breakfast plates, and the boxes, and the paint. It's boring stuff." Jackson smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held space for small human truths. "Boring is underrated," he said. Finn laughed. The sound was a bright thing in the winter light. They had made a life that was the sum of small mercies. The legal system had done its part. The DA had argued the public duty. Sheriff Miller had seen a boy at the side of the road and given his name weight. Holloway's power had been checked not by drama, but by paper, and the righteous patience of public procedure. And the real change had happened in the kitchen, the studio, the late-night phone calls, the weatherproof box on the roadside, things that didn't make newspapers, but that kept a human life from being swallowed by an unforgiving night. Years from that first night, the painting of Jackson would show a man who had learned slowly to be whole. Finn's canvases would hang in more places. The weatherproof box would have a new coat of paint. Sheriff Miller would not when he passed the house. Holloway would be a footnote in the story of what it takes to keep a child safe. When viewers read the details in the description for help and resources, they'd find the names of local shelters and crisis lines, places that exist precisely for the kind of person who had stood on the roadside that night. Finn had needed one small, courageous thing, someone to stop. Jackson had done that. He'd offered not only shelter, but the messy, gorgeous work of being human with someone. The rest, law, therapy, community, had filled in around them. On the porch, as twilight thickened into night, Finn leaned into Jackson with a trust that had been taught by each careful act. "Thank you," he murmured. Jackson's hand found Finn's, fingers intertwining like a promise that was practical and soft. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he answered. And somewhere beyond the yard, down the stretch of cleared road where hazard lights once flashed and snow had once shredded the sky, a small box stood with a sign and supplies, a public little miracle, and a testament that sometimes the right thing is simply to stop, to open the door, and to feed someone soup. If you or someone you know is in danger, there are resources listed in the description below to help. If you can, support your local youth shelters and LGBTQ+ organizations. Small acts keep people from being left at the roadside. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing to stay with us for more stories of found family and quiet rescue.